Well, welcome to another edition of Ed Talks. I'm talking to Richard Berridge today. Richard is a long-term advocate of the build-to-rent sector and, more importantly, consults with a lot of the players in the sector. And there are one or two things I want to come on to with that. Before I do, I'd like to thank the guys at Nicholas Van Patrick for letting me use their boardroom again to record in here in London. And thank you very much, Richard, for coming along. My knowledge of the build-to-rent sector is considerably less than his, which is why I'm talking to you here. And most of you who are watching this, when you hear about the build-to-rent sector, you will think of people buying big blocks of flats from developers and putting groovy people into them to live with full sky and a gym on site, etc., etc. But what has, I think, become more interesting as we've gone on is what is called the single-family housing part of the build-to-rent sector, which is where operators operate either small tranches of a development or individual properties pepper-potted all over the place. Now, I have very little idea of exactly what the size of this sector is. It's not big. So, Richard, tell us a little bit about how big the sector is and how the single-family housing sector fits into it, and then we can talk in a little more detail after that.
Thanks, Ed. So it's good to be here. I haven't seen you for a long time, so it's always good to have a chat with you. So the build-to-rent sector as a whole, and let's use build-to-rent as the umbrella term, is about 130 operational homes at the moment, and most of that is in metropolitan areas. So,
when you say 130, you mean these are the single-family housing, or these are total?
That's the whole lot. Out of that, about 15,000 are the single-family homes.
Okay, when you said 130, you mean 130,000?
130,000.
130 homes. What the hell are you bothering to talk about this for? Okay,
yeah.
Good.
That's smaller than some people's.
Okay, so 130,000 in the sector, in the build-to-rent sector, as multi-family homes, or whatever you want to describe them as flats, and 15,000 single-family homes.
Well, about 115,000 overall, 115,000 as multi-family. 15,000 is single family.
Okay, so it's still quite a small sector, isn't it?
It is quite a small sector, and it's institutions are a little bit like sheep in a way. I shouldn't really say that because they're going to hate me for it, but they do follow each other down the track a little way. And also getting to scale is a little bit easier when you buy a block of flats which has got 500 flats in it, as opposed to buying single family homes which may have a size of about 60 homes or something like that.
So what has been stopping people buying the single? I mean, we discussed this, and obviously if you're buying a pepper potted single family home portfolio, they could be pepper potted all over the place. So is that still one of the major negatives?
Yeah, in a way, it's scale, and when you kind of think about the people who are involved in this, it's sort of L&G and M&G and a lot of the big investors, and they always think in terms of scale. For them, scale is everything. And I think it took them a long time to get their heads around that scaling single-family housing meant buying smaller schemes, but more often. And they do pepper pot them from time to time. They prefer not to pepper pot if possible, because there are management issues around that. I'm not so sure whether that's true or not. But they do tend to buy sort of tranches or parts of schemes, and they might buy the whole of the first phase, which might amount to anything from either 60 to 150 homes, or they might buy bits of each phase so that it's fully integrated into the wider scheme. So generally speaking, I mean, the difficulty that I think most of them have had to date is getting their heads round buying a lot of schemes instead of just one big scheme, and that's been the problem.
Okay, so why is that a problem?
Well, because, most of them, and I'm not going to quote who said it, but one of them once said to me, I'm not going to get out of bed for anything less than 30 million quid. Now, if you buy a 60-home scheme in the north of England, that's not going to cost you 30 million quid. You're going to probably deploy about, maybe 10 to 15 million pounds. And you have to deploy the same resources for that sum as you would be for a 100 million pound scheme. So for them, it is more cost effective to say that.
Well, that much would be fairly obvious to anyone in business, I suppose, that if you're buying lots in a small scheme, the cost of doing it each time is the same. So I completely understand that. So is the opportunity perhaps at the moment that there are an awful lot of people who've been in rentals, and we know that landlords have been copying it now for about 10 years, ever since George Osborne started taxing them, and with recent changes and stamp duty hikes and all of the stuff that we know about. Is the opportunity in the single family housing sector the fact that landlords are selling up, or is it that alongside the 106 part of developments, developers who are increasingly feeling the pinch and having difficulty in selling stuff, perhaps in the way that not in the way they have in the past. I mean, in the past they've sold stuff standing on their heads. Recently, that's been a lot more difficult. is that the attraction then for this, that developers can get rid of a little bit of the extra tranche of each development to a build-to-rent developer?
That can be the case. I mean, it's, for a bit of context here, it's actually quite difficult because there have been a whole range of things that have happened to make single family more attractive than, say, multifamily. I mean, gateway to it is just one of them. You can't build a tall building now and make it viable because it's extremely difficult to do so. And the thing is there's a thing about risk as well. When you're building a particularly complicated building, and most multifamily buildings are quite complicated, as you sort of previously said.
So multifamily, just for those of you who don't, the tower blocks. Okay, okay.
So the tower blocks are quite complicated to build. You've got a lot of M&E in there. You've got lifts, you've got health and safety, you've got concrete frames, you've got tier one contractors in there, you've got tier one consultants, an expensive and risky business. And investment is all about risk. So risk and return. And what we've seen, and that is reflected in the yield curve. I know you kind of know that. And what that tends to mean is that the lower the yield, the less risky that investment is. The greater risk you take, the better return you want. What people have realised is around houses is that they're fundamentally not as risky to build. They are pretty straightforward to build. They're not complicated. They're quite sustainable to build. You can build them energy efficient. Your tenants who live in those tend to stay longer and more stable. So we've got an asset class here which is easy to build, easy to build sustainably.
These are the houses, individual houses.
The houses, easy to make energy efficient. The people who live in those houses, they're paying you rent, stay longer, and they tend to be more stable. So we've all of a sudden they've sort of realised that despite the fact that it might be slightly more difficult to scale up, as they call it, which is buy lots and lots and lots of houses, and they wouldn't want to do that on single site anyway because of the density of houses, which is very different, and so is the renter density is very different. They've suddenly realised that this actually is in many ways, and this is kind of borne out by a lot of research that's been done recently, a much more attractive asset class. Now you have to bear in mind that 60% of the PRs, pretty much you probably know, are houses. And 80% of what we live in this country are houses. 83% of what we built last year were houses. We're not talking about a typology that is smaller than the number of flats. It's very easy to think that if you live in the centre of London or you're involved in the build-to-rent sector, generally speaking, and all you really focus on is building a 35, 40-storey tower, the world revolves around apartments. It doesn't. The world in the UK revolves around houses for both renters and homeowners.
Yes, so I suppose, okay, so if we move away from buying smaller tranches in multifamily developments, which is one way that you can put single family housing aside, if we focus on the pepper potted houses, a lot of people watching this will say, well, why on earth would someone focus on that sort of development? But actually, I know from my experience that there are quite a lot of people over the years who've built up portfolios in the same street or in very, very close by streets. They'll have bought 3 or 4 houses. And the difficulty, obviously, with those, is what's putting people off the management of them. I mean, obviously, part of the reason we started talking was because what I do at Vuba enables quite a lot of people who run those sort of pepper potted developments to do the stuff they want to do at distance and at scale. Yeah. But is that the major issue, the management of these things, or?
Yeah, that was quite a significant piece early on because if you bear in mind that the way that the build-to-rent sector got traction initially was in the urban space, and frankly, what would happen is that the operational manager would, generally speaking, with all the amenity within that building, sort of take up sort of house within that building, and everything would be managed in-house within that sort of hermetically sealed tube.
Yeah.
Everything was there. When we first started talking about single-family housing, people would start to talk about, well, how on earth are we going to manage it? We're not going to be anywhere near there. Our base is here, and also they're all over the place. And how are we going to get people to mend the taps? How are we going to get people to ensure that everything is done on time and in a timely way? How are we going to manage the estates? And they didn't really consider. Or they didn't feel that there were solutions out there. At the time, and I think that's kind of more of an ideology thing around the sort of multifamily piece or the big blocks. And I think there wasn't some thinking around. There was some general thinking around how difficult that was going to be, and they weren't considering enough the solution. If I go back to the global financial crisis, and what happened in the United States. There were some really big companies like Invitation Homes and some others who spotted an arbitrage opportunity to buy really quite substantial tranches of mortgage defaults houses, because which they did do, and that is called single family rental over there. And they did this, and they bought hundreds of houses of them, amongst themselves. And the issue there was, and I keep pointing out to people over here who keep sort of saying it's going to be very difficult to manage this block of 15 houses in this village, is that those tranches of mortgage defaults weren't all bunched together. They were all over the place. In terms of, they were your ultimate pepper pot everywhere. And they managed very successfully to manage those buildings because they, Americans, whatever you say about them right at the moment, are solution driven.
Yeah.
And they'll say, we'll figure out a way to do this.
Yeah, always have been. Okay, so again, moving away from the tower blocks and multifamily housing, and certainly my experience is that the average landlord, as I mentioned earlier, owns more than one property. So, and as a lot of them are getting out, is there not an edict from on high, but you've got the BPF and various other organisations under which build to rent sort of takes as its umbrella. Is this beginning to be recognised by some of the overarching organisations as a good solution?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the BPF. That's one. So I was on a call with the BPF only a couple of hours ago, and this was single family was one of the topics. But there's also the Association for Rental Living, ARL, and they've been championing the build to rent sector now for about 8 or 9 years now. So there are sort of sector specific bodies who are very specifically involved in build to rent. And if you look at the BPF, for instance, one of their main roles is actually to speak to government. So government are also taking notice around build to rent, and they're taking notice around also single family particularly. And the reason for that is that they have, as we all know, some quite big ambitions about building more homes. And that's a difficult task. And we all know that we're probably way down on where we should be. This year we're have been building fewer homes, or 2024 we've been building fewer homes. And it's kind of, how do you kickstart that? How do we get to where we're going? And single family particularly is extremely comfortable amongst other tenures. And it's one of its sort of unique pieces. If both you and I have probably bought investment properties in London over time, and we've sold them, and the investor says to you, is it a broken block? I don't want a broken block. I want a block which I can manage in its entirety. I don't want a few of them have been sold off. So you can't do that with the multifamily, the big towers. It has to be one per thing. But single family actually is quite comfortable with that. Whether it's pepper potted or tranches, whatever, it works quite well within a multi-tenure environment. And that's quite interesting, because that gives you a much richer community. And it also means that single family, if the investor comes in an early stage, what he's looking to do for any house builder, whether it's regional or SME or national, is take maybe that early stage, de-risk that early stage, get that infrastructure built. And once that is done, it doesn't matter how big the scheme is. It could be 60 homes and they might take the first 20. It doesn't matter, or it could be much bigger than that. You've got single family then that is, as far as the government is concerned, is an enabler. And that's really quite interesting. Although it's only 15,000 homes at the moment, the great thing about single family is there is nowhere really it can't be built. We can build it from Land's End to John O'Groats. You can't do that with multifamily.
How do you define single family? Because obviously 15,000 sounds like a small number, but in the PRS you've got, 5 million homes in the PRS, and another 3 million or 4 million in the assisted housing sector. And so 15,000 is a tiny little number. Where does the definition of a single family housing property start, and a landlord who's got 4 or 5 properties stop?
Yeah, well, that's quite interesting. There's a massive debate in the sector and amongst the consultants about what's built to rent, what's PRS, what's single family, what's not. And it tends to revolve around, I think for a lot of people, particularly the consultants who are transacting on this stuff, I think they think about it in terms of scale, generally speaking. I think I prefer to think about it in terms of the management piece. So if the management piece is professional, sort of, you've got the professional operational managers who are thinking very clearly about what do we do to go the extra mile here? What's our customer service piece look like? How are we thinking differently?
That would define it as an FS.
For me, it would a little bit more. And what we've seen now, have seen some, particularly single family, is much more accessible for agents generally, and those agents who have been quite with a bit of foresight. A lot of them, especially some of the bigger ones now, and some of them, slightly smaller ones as well. They've begun to see that they've got a new homes department, they've got a block management department, they've got a lettings department, they've got all the skill sets that can help them manage these schemes. And what they haven't done in the past, started recently, is to start to think about some of those new build homes that their new homes are building is going to the investor as well.
I completely see that. Do you know what? It's like a light bulb going on. I mean, I hope some of the people who are watching this can get the light bulb going on as well, because actually, of course, if someone's going to rent something, they're going to prefer to do it with someone who has got, I mean, okay, let me phrase that another way. If you're renting a property from someone who owns 4 or 5 properties and they're a single person, they're probably unlikely to have a big management operation behind them. I mean, the majority of people, in my experience, they employ a good agent.
Yeah.
When I was at D&G, I know a lot of our people at Douglas and Gordon had multiple properties, and we did it for them. But we weren't what I would describe as experts in the area. We weren't looking necessarily at the long-term viability of those particular properties. Yeah. And a build-to-rent SFH operator is more likely to be looking longer term at the value. So many people in the PRS landlords are just-in-time type landlords. They're not taking a really good long-term view. So I can completely see that if you're looking at this with a proper build-to-rent operator behind you, that there are going to be some advantages to that. So I can see. Okay, so what's the ambition in the sector? I mean, 15,000 is small. We know it's about 130. I thought it was a little bit more than that, but nevertheless, it's still in overall terms.
The wider sector is about 130.
Yeah, but that's still pretty small.
The house is about 15,000.
Yes, and bearing in mind that, as you said earlier, and again, it's fascinating to hear, 60% in PRS are houses, 80% of places we live in are houses in the UK. Clearly, that could be better reflected in the SFH sector.
Yeah.
So, what would you advise if someone was watching this, and a lot of agents watch this? What would you say to them in terms of the sector? Would you say that if they're managing stuff for landlords and they're with a lot of landlords who are thinking of getting out, and I don't care who the landlord is, they're probably thinking, shit, this is getting a bit heavy, we might think about getting out. What could an agent do to perhaps persuade their landlord?
You're on a bit of my one of my hobby horses here, because my hobby horse around single family is all about localism, and that's really the interesting thing. If we look at, I kind of do some stuff with some of the big consultancies as well in terms of viability and rent analysis and that kind of stuff as well. But when it comes to sort of looking at a scheme that is maybe, I don't know, let's talk about Chalfont St Giles or somewhere, I don't know, anywhere. Let's say sort of 60 houses were going up there. The thing is, you've got local agents who have been local agents there for a long time, who have an intimate knowledge of the location, they have an intimate knowledge of the local, of what's going on in that area. And that's the sort of knowledge that they can use in order to start to help the investors of any size decide on the viability of that scheme. Because these people have got no local knowledge. You've got some of the big consultancy companies who will go into, and single families like this, it looks into areas where the multi-family stuff isn't, that dense stuff isn't. So basically everywhere across the country. And we pretty much know that there are agents who are experts. And you've probably got a big sort of Ed Mead sort of fan base of agents that sort of tune into this all the time. But there are so many of them who have got skill sets and knowledge and experience of an area that the big consultancies don't have. And that's a big plus for them, particularly in single family of any sort of scale. And I've tried to sort of make this point to agents time after time. So medium-sized ones, or not necessarily the smallest, but the medium-sized ones do have, operational sort of management expertise. They all do property management. They probably have a small new homes division. They probably might do some other stuff in the surveying division and so forth, what have you. Those are all the skill sets you need, but you need to bring them together, and you need to.
But how do the small agents get their voices heard?
Well, to be honest with you, it's a bit of catch-22 situation in a sense, because I think a lot of the investors don't forget, if we're talking about an investment base, which is also now a lot broader, because that investment piece is a lot smaller in many cases. And there are people who have come to me, and I've had a couple of conversations with some quite interesting people, and I think this will become a thing, what I would term aggregators. So they're people who are probably backed by private equity, who are doing that donkey work, that real legwork stuff, is going along, aggregating schemes, going into certain areas and saying, well, we're only going to get 20 there, might get 30 here, 60 there perhaps, until they build up a portfolio of about 400 to 500, which they will then sell on to a significant scheme. And those smaller investors, and I know some of them, are talking to the smaller agents. So this is the time that those smaller agents can start to think about what they're doing, how they can sort of behave in an institutionally acceptable sense. How they can, I don't want to call it professionalise up, because they're professional within their own.
No, but I know what happens with a lot of agents is that they forget that they can actually, if there's a development going on locally, one of the things that I know most agents would love to be able to do is to get into the new home stuff. A lot of them are too small and they can't get into it. But they will know it's going on. Yeah. So from their point of view, if they can spot 3 or 4 developments around Chalfont St Giles, for instance, going up, can they think about looking at those developments, seeing what's going up, make it their business to know, and then perhaps take those somehow to an investor and saying, by the way, did you know that these are going up? Yeah. In other words, they can act as a buying agent in one sense, and they've got the knowledge of the area and they can approach the investors. If they were going to do that, how do they? Is it social media? Is it LinkedIn?
A bit of all that kind of thing. It's called social media, LinkedIn, but also you've got to get into you've got to be part of the in crowd, if you like. So you've got to look at the BPF, or probably particularly more like the Association for Rental Living, which is not an expensive organisation to be part of, which runs courses, or even sort of looking at people like the Property Institute, who run courses on build to rent. But the Association of Rental Living is really good, because that, is basically an organisation for build to rent and single family housing. So within that organisation, you will see contacts who are investors, who are suppliers, with third party suppliers, who are operational managers, and you will learn from them. And they do an awful lot of courses and webinars on operational management or the investor side.
I would have thought that's quite an interesting way for agents not only to be able to make some money out of the build-to-rent sector, but also to then develop the knowledge about how to service those sectors. Yeah. So in other words, if they packaged up 3 local developments or bits of 3 local developments, took them, found an investor and said, okay, you do that, we will then build up a professional department. They're local, so they're already on site. They can start. I can completely see where the sort of organic nature of that comes from. So I think that's fascinating. I think that's a really good learn, potentially, for some people. I'm assuming that's sort of what you'd want.
Well, it's a learning environment. The ARL does all sorts of things, and they're very good at it. And as soon as you enter that environment's all about build to rent, whether it's kind of like doing parcel services, or whether it's Viewber, for instance, or what you can do. Or learning about customer service, or how you treat people properly. You have to bear in mind that many of these people, for instance, I do some stuff with Audra Lamoon of Liveware, and what Audra will do, for instance, for an institution or for an operational manager who isn't close by, she might be tasked with the idea of phone up all the agents, do mystery shopping for me, and see which one you would recommend would represent us well in that lease-up piece. Who do you think would do that well? And so, you've got to be on your mettle all the time, because, as we know, one of the things that build to rent has brought into the sector, again, I don't want to call it professionalisation, but I think it's an acknowledgement that the customer service piece probably wasn't as good as it.
No, it's very true. I have to say, it took me a long time to understand that the build to rent operators have a set way they like to do things, and they do that for a reason, because it works. And just because it's single family or pepper potted or whatever, it doesn't alter that. So it's all the same thing. Okay, well look, we've been talking now for 24 minutes. I think that's more than enough. Personally, I've learned a lot from that. I mean, thank you, Richard. I really do think that there's an interesting thing for agents here to perhaps think about looking around at developments locally and looking at it from a different way, rather than trying to get at the investor, not at the investor, at the builder, or the original landowner and saying, can we be your agent, which is the way they tend to look at it. If they come at this from a different way and try and look at developments locally and see whether they can then go and find someone who would want to buy those and they can then manage it, that's a big win. So I think that's been fascinating. I think a lot of people who are looking at this might be slightly shocked by how small the sector is. But as you say, quite a lot of it's down to definition, but it certainly is growing. I know my business is beginning to grow into that sector. Yeah. And I think there's an extra turbocharging coming in from the fact that there are a lot of landlords, some of whom are bigger, who are going to be thinking, shit, we want to get out of this. This might be a way of doing it. So again, for agents to look at that and wondering what they might do with those portfolios. At the moment, most people would be thinking, okay, well, we'll sell them individually. But actually, they might be missing a trick.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, the viewer business particularly, I think, sometimes you go on to people and you talk about they talk about how they're going to manage and we can't get over there or we can't do this or how are we going to do inventory, how are we going to do this, and go, oh God's sake, guys, I mean, come on, do your research. It's certainly possible to do that and it's not difficult. And the great thing, I think about your business particularly, and I was a viewer at one time, and very quietly, I wanted to understand how it worked, and I thought, well, I'll do that for a little bit.
I didn't know that.
There you go, very crafty, yes. So I was a viewer at one time, and that was interesting, and I kind of thought, the people who sort of do it, because you vet them really quite rigorously, and you've got DBS checks and all that kind of stuff, and so when you've got people representing you and institutionally, one of the things you want that customer journey, and this is something we talk about all the time, that customer journey has got to be peerless because they've got to want to stay, they've got to trust. Yeah. And part of the ethos about the build-to-rent sector is how do we make the PRS a better place? And that's not trying to be sort of like really sort of snotty about it. That's saying it wasn't good, we've got to make it better, and everybody's got to be involved in it. And what I see from the smaller agent's point of view is that if they kind of realise that rental journey has been a bit rubbish to date, and they can really up their game, they're gonna really be some very, very successful people because the institutional sector is coming at a pace. There are billions of pounds of equity now waiting to come into single family housing. It's all about supply. They can't get supply fast enough. You kind of look at what Nest has done with Barrett's, and I think the others have done, I can't remember the other third party is there. But that's thousands of homes that they want to do.
Well, there you go, guys. You heard it from Richard. Okay, there's a huge opportunity here, and I think it's one you can grasp. So I really hope some of this has helped. If you've got any questions, which I suspect one or two of you might have, I'm very happy if you want to get in touch with me in the comments underneath. You probably know Richard anyway, maybe, but I'm very happy to pass you on. So, Richard, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, that's a pleasure. Good to see you.